costs about 6 months.
It's not funny because Logan did.
Count back because you know when you
We tested. Logan made a joke and nobody heard it.
Gabriel thing
And then I made the same joke and everybody laughed.
John Baptist was born,
Okay.
Yes, right.
Yeah, that's right. That gives me a lot of
Well, you weren't a part of our prep
Y'all didn't even
time, so
tell me. I just David came in.
all right.
Yeah, that's a lack of communication. Oh, not bad. Okay, here we're gonna go and get our Wednesday night started. We're gonna have an overabundance of coffee if you would like coffee at any point.
Why don't we make some coffee?
Cause one, yeah, I'll take it. Announcement before we get going. Oh, you can just come on in, make it when you can. I'm just kidding. We have a girls' night tomorrow night at 6:30 in here, and so that's the girls' event that we posted about earlier in the week. But if you want to be at that, it will be in here at 6:30, and I don't remember what woman of the Bible we'll be studying, although they told me. Ruth. Thank you, Hannah. Studying Ruth. So, anyways, that is, I think, the only announcement. So, good news.
All right. How are y'all midweek? Good? We are, as you see in your handouts, I've already heard some of y'all start talking about amongst yourselves, talking about Christians and holidays. And so it is a study that I think is intriguing and interesting to think about. I believe until we started teaching this class, it's not something that I thought in depth about except maybe Easter and Christmas. Those are probably the two big ones that usually came to mind when we dealt with any kind of discussion about Christians and holidays and how or what or if we should even be involved in holidays and to what extent and what we did compared to especially around us and my denominational friends growing up. And so, it was, I think, very interesting for me to start thinking about, should Christians celebrate holidays at all? And so as we developed this lesson, it was challenging to me, at least, to kind of think a little bit more critically as I thought about a Christian and how we respond to these type of special days that are just kind of embraced by the world and culture around us. And as Christians, what are we supposed to do? Just right off the bat, as you think about Christians and holidays, and should we be involved or celebrate, what specific maybe issue or concern maybe comes to your mind at the beginning of this?
Whether Jesus was born on Christmas or
Okay, jumped right to Christmas. That's all right. What was Jesus, whether Jesus was born on Christmas or not? First thing that kind of pops in the mind. All right, what else? Any other concerns or thoughts about celebrating holidays?
Halloween.
All right, Halloween. It's always one of my concerns. Now, especially as a father, I think about that a little bit more, about what you see around us. I think that's something for us to think about and consider and talk about as we kind of go through some of our points tonight. As we think about, should we be involved in Halloween? There are different aspects, right, of Halloween. I think about the very macabre kind of, gruesome part of it, and I think, I don't want my children to even think about that. I know, like, there's a Disney show, The Zombies. You ever seen the zombie movies or shows on I think there's 3 of them or something. I don't remember. But anyway, my girls wanted to watch those, and for a long time I pushed back. Because the last thing I wanted is my children thinking about zombies, the undead. Then I watched it, and I was like, this is not the zombies like I'm thinking about. And we let them watch it. But anyway, it's one of those things, though, when you think about what is surrounding someone during like a Halloween season, that's what you see. And so the question is, should Christians be around that? Should we be involved in it? What else? Anything else pop into your mind immediately? Easter. All right. We can talk about that too as we kind of think about these issues. Easter, of course, you'll see being celebrated on a Sunday. It's always on a Sunday. I always kind of thought about it as I grew up, as about calculating it. Obviously, it's not on the same day every year, so that's kind of intriguing and interesting. It's calculated on a different kind of lunar schedule with regard to things. When it occurs compared to the springtime and stuff. Doesn't even get into the beginning and the origins of it, which I want to get to that in just a second as we intro this. But yeah, Easter, sunrise services. Y'all see that advertised as Christians, right? We see it. Our denominational friends, most assuredly, even some churches in the Brotherhood maybe sometimes promote that. that should make us kind of think, okay, should we be involved in that? What does that mean? There are a lot of different things that kind of go into this, and I will tell you, I don't think we're going to have all the answers tonight, but what we want to do is kind of go into some different viewpoints, think about the different ways to view it as Christians and how you can view it. Some of it will apply to some holidays versus other holidays, probably a little bit more specifically as you think about and think through these issues. But then we really want to hit these biblical principles and kind of think about, what does the Bible say about celebrations? What does the Bible talk about, doing these things that you see around us in the world today? Because I think we want to challenge us to kind of think a little deeper, a little more critically about what we're doing and how we're doing it as Christians, because that's kind of what our point and purpose is. I want to start off this. As we intro this class, I always like to look at is, why are these holidays there even at all? And so what we kind of look at is we have different holidays of different sorts. We've already thrown out several, right? You can also throw out birthdays. You can think about some other holidays such as just national holidays, I guess. You can think about that. We have holidays celebrated by the nationality. Wherever you may be, you may have a national holiday. We talk about Christmas, Halloween, Easter. Valentine's Day is one you'll see in your handout. We kind of throw that in there. It's not always seen as a big holiday, but it is a holiday. The word itself, holiday, you can kind of guess the derision of that word, right? What do you think? What's the first part of it? Holy day. Have you ever thought about that? So when you look at it, the word holiday derives itself as a day to be set apart. And so that's really kind of the idea of a holiday, and that we see transliterated in the English language, is being this holy day, this separate day, set apart for a specific reason or a purpose. And so the question that I kind of look at is, how do we get here with regard to the different holidays? And we don't have time to get into all the origin stories. But I think what is very interesting when you start thinking about these big time holidays such as Christmas or Easter or even Halloween, that they are holidays that have been set apart starting for a paganistic reason. And I think that's very interesting to kind of look at how this all began. It started with pagans wanting to have days filled with all kinds of different things. And again, you can get into it. It can be either sexual in nature. It can be something that's kind of a more perverted or kind of a weird. I know one of the, I think that's when I look up, the Valentine's Day. It's based upon the feast of Lupercalia, which is a Roman entity, god, I believe. And that the idea of that was celebrating fertility. And so they did some really weird rituals. If you were to read about the origin of Valentine's Day, which again, you can Google it and look at it, just be careful what you're looking at. But you're going to see that they had people, the women would be spanked or hit with the skins of the animals that are killed during the course of this. It's just really weird stuff. But again, it echoes with regard to paganism and what you deal with. Halloween, All Hallows Eve. If you go back and look at the origins of Halloween, you're going to see kind of where it begins. And then what you're going to see is over time, what has happened is those who are Christians have adopted these holidays, but they've tried to change them and morph them into something that was more stomachable or more tolerated by their faith. Does that make sense? And so I found that very intriguing and interesting, because as a kid, I never thought about that. I mean, Christmas, you're thinking Santa Claus and presents, or maybe you're thinking about the birth of Jesus. But if you look at the pagan origins of Christmas, that's not what it is at all. But when the Roman Catholic Church started wanting to change and twist and create these holy days to counterbalance those things that were pagan, that's where we started becoming this culture that had these other type of celebrations that would kind of come about. So as we think through these lessons, as we think through these viewpoints, we look at these different principles in the scriptures, I want to challenge y'all, think a little deeper. Think a little bit more than just, hey, Valentine's Day is a day where you have a Valentine and you ask someone to be your Valentine and you give them flowers and chocolate, you go out for dinner or whatever it is. It may be a little deeper than that. And maybe it's not. And I don't want to necessarily scare everybody thinking, oh, you need to be anti-holiday, because I will say that that's not my viewpoint on it at all. But what the scripture should do is challenge, I think, how we approach it, how we deal with it, and how we kind of look through it with a Christian view instead of this world view that kind of relies on what culture around us is saying.
So, as you think about this class, our purpose has been to bring up things to make you think. And so that's kind of what we're doing with this class tonight. What do you say about religious holidays? When somebody asks you about Christmas, Easter, things like that, do you have a response? Something that you, or do you?
Or do you avoid the question?
Because you know how the world treats Christmas, right? It's the birth of Christ, right? I looked it up. It's probably more like September when he was born. But, so how do you respond? Or do you? Does it ever come up? Do you just go along and say, yep?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was just trying to make sure. So it's interesting for me on the topic of Christmas because I find more like debating and like disagreements amongst like people who identify as like believers that will kind of argue more about how to celebrate Christmas, when you should do it, things like that. More so than people of the world, because normally, sometimes like I've had maybe one or two people ask me what Christmas is about, like they didn't know like why I celebrate it. And so it was just, something as simple as like celebrating the birth of Christ, although that's not, necessarily when he was born. But like I said, I found it more amongst believers who are like, well, he wasn't born in December, so you shouldn't celebrate it at all. Or you should really be celebrating the birth of Christ every day. This is just kind of the time that we've allotted to be like, okay, we're going to go big about it.
All right, so he basically made the 2 points that I have. The 2 viewpoints are, no, you should not celebrate it because it's not guided by Scripture as far as something we should do. And the other view is, hey, it's a time when people are thinking about it. Use that to our advantage. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, usually if people ask me about it, I just say that personally I don't believe Jesus was born on Christmas. If they have further questions, I'll explain why I feel that way. But then I explain that I'm thankful that people do like to go to church, especially like around that time, or think about Jesus, talk about Jesus, get Jesus out in the media. Just, it's good to have that knowledge that people are talking about it.
Okay, if someone believes that way, that it is good, that's one of the viewpoints, that it's good, that we talk about it, it brings people, maybe we wouldn't have a starting place in a conversation about Jesus without this opportunity. If you look at that that way, how far do you go with it? Let's look at the Bible. That's a good place to start. Romans chapter 14 gives a little insight. Somebody read for me, please. Let's just start at verse 1 and read all the way through 6.
Receive one who is weak in the faith, but do not dispute over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. And he who does not eat or does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks.
All right. So, what's the context here? The overall context. I know it's talking about eating in days, but what's the context? Like, what's the overall writing thought here? Are these matters that God has commanded, or are they matters of opinion? They're opinion, right? The context shows you that they're not a faith or a doctrine thing. So where God has given guidelines for us, there's no room for discussion, right? We read it. The Bible says, as a man speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. You do that, I do that, we say the same thing, right? But in these matters, there's seems to be an attitude. And what is that attitude that we should have about this?
That unity is important, and that there are some issues that are not important enough to divide over. And that if we have an opinion about something that's not strictly defined by the scriptures, that we should make sure that it's I guess you could say a reasoned out opinion, and that we are fully convinced, as the Bible says here, but that if somebody differs with us, that we shouldn't make a bigger deal out of that than we ought to. That our unity is more important than having the right opinion about something that God doesn't nail down.
Exactly right.
Mature Christians should be flexible.
I'm sorry, speak up.
Mature Christians should be flexible when it comes to subjects like this and
These matters of opinion, right. Look at the first verse there. It says, one who is weak in faith. There are other scriptures that speak to this that I don't want to take, maybe David will talk to you about, but it is important that we see that if we are stronger in the faith, that we have concern for those that are weaker. That's talked about in 1 Corinthians 8 about meat offered to idols. You know, there was a big problem, people coming out of pagan worship. If you bought some of this food that had been offered to an idol, Paul's like, we know that's idols are nothing. But if there's somebody that bothers in our assembly, then I'm never going to eat meat. Right? That's basically the way he goes with that. And it's astonishing to me that in our culture, not just in this realm that we're talking about, but in a lot of times in worship matters, the people that are more of faith than we are don't care enough about us that have problems with things. They go on before, and we should come with them. Right? And that's not the attitude at all from Scripture. The one who is stronger in the faith is always to look out for the one who's weaker. That's just a side note. I won't charge you for that one. But Romans 14, 5-6 refers to days that are not that are religiously neutral to God, and He is indifferent toward them. No religious practice. So, what does that mean about Easter or Christmas? How would you handle that now that you see this verse?
For the individual.
Yeah, for the individual.
You have to be fully convicted in whichever direction you're going to go.
Right. So let's talk about this a little bit further. How does this play when we start talking about a congregation of the Lord's church that would have a nativity scene on a Sunday morning as part of worship? How would you react to that? My first question is why? Has God not told us how to worship? And people would say, well, it's Christmas. That's what I like. I'm going to say this one time. What I like or don't like has absolutely nothing to do with the worship of God. Nothing. God has told us how to worship, what He wants, because we worship Him, not ourselves. And we got to be careful that we don't overstep and do something we want to do just because the world does it. We have to be careful. But when it comes to our own home, let's say, if you want to celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th, and you're not binding that on other people, not a religious service, right? It's not part of your worship. Same thing with Easter. I love hunt Easter eggs, right? When you've got little kids and It's always fun. But no religious connotation in that. So we need to be careful. These matters that God are indifferent about, we just need to make sure we don't carry them too far. Are any questions about that?
Easter is an interesting one, simply because we celebrate that every Sunday. And so the eggs are the part that don't have anything to do with it.
Right.
Yeah.
But you talk about the resurrection of Jesus, that's why we're here.
Right.
So is there ever a wrong time to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus? No. Now, could you do it in a way that's distracting, controversial and divisive? Sure. But that holiday, how we got the bunnies and eggs, I'm not sure.
It's not good. You
Yeah, I
research
would
it.
say.
It has to do with,
It's more paganistic stuff.
yeah.
Okay, but anyway.
It's a fertility thing, but honestly.
But again, we're going to celebrate that next week, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing about that.
And the difference would be command, or
Right.
pattern, right? When there are activities and dates and ceremonies, the Bible is riddled with God's people setting up times to remember, actual holy days, times of significance to celebrate. And we're talking about days that are not like that. The
Well,
application of
and that's what Romans 14 specifically talking about there, guys. And I know we put them in your handout here, talking about some of the holidays, like the ideas of Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles. Y'all can do your own research and study that in the Old Testament, but those were holy days, literally holy days set apart by God for his people to set apart themselves and focus on something spiritually minded. Now, that the issue is those were never carried over to the New Testament. But Romans 14 is talking about a group of probably Jewish Christians who struggled with giving up that tradition, that religious celebration in their lives. And they're pretty much just saying that, hey, if you want to keep celebrating, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just not required. God's saying that's not enough for everybody. You don't have to say, hey, Gentiles, you now have to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You've got to celebrate the Passover feast when you had nothing to do with it in your history. But it's nothing wrong with the Jews continuing to recognize or even think about those things in their lives. But it's just not something that is commanded for everyone to participate in. So how does that translate to us? It's not required for us to celebrate the Feast of Passover when the Passover feast was supposed to be celebrated. And in fact, we have a spiritual Passover. If you read the book of Hebrews, the Passover we celebrate is each first day of the week, dealing with the Passover and the lamb that we have that was given on our behalf. Being Jesus Christ. And so that's the celebration, that first day of the week celebration is what has been adopted in our life. Sorry, Mark.
You good? All right. Somebody else has?
Hannah? Oh, okay.
All right, let me cover, I'm going to cover viewpoint 3 and viewpoint 4 so we can get into really kind of the meat of, like all our classes, the principles. And John will jump into maybe the first parts of the principles after this. Viewpoint 3 may be more pressing as the years go by, at least in this country we live in, this idea that maybe holidays should be avoided just because of the materialism and the nature that has, maybe in our culture, in our world. I mean, you can go shopping anytime from the beginning to the end of the summer all the way till now, and there's always a rotation of some new aisle, of something new to purchase, to give to somebody else. Think about it. Christmas is almost before Halloween, and Halloween's almost, midsummer. And where are we now? We're a few weeks. You got Valentine's and St. Patty's Day. And then what month do we not have something on the retail shelves for sale? To entice us to spend our money to give for a holiday or for a gift.
God's money.
Thank you.
Talk about more the steward. I mean, y'all don't forget the stewardship principle. We talked about that, I think, in some other lessons, but that's where that point comes into play, I think, because it would really apply not just in holidays, it applies elsewhere. And as a parent, you're going to realize that.
So as I get into that, think about the principles here, like Luke chapter 16, 13, right? You can't serve both God and money, and where's your stewardship going to be? And then think about where your treasures are. What are you laying up? In Matthew 6, 19 through 34. And then maybe even more applicable is Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. We're cautioned to put away or put to death the evil desire. Think about it as our children. there is it almost covetousness now on what they're wanting? Or maybe as we go into adulthood of what we're wanting for Christmas, have we gone past the idea of gift making and gift expectations? Think about just the spending nature of money. 41% of Americans are willing to go in debt for the Christmas holiday. Think about that. Go in debt for gifts. Last year alone, there's $531.8 billion in retail spent in December. Average is about $1,600 per person that was spent, about $3,800 per household. And you apply that just to the Christmas act of giving gifts, $184 billion was in 2023. That had doubled in less than 10 years. Halloween, $12 billion on costumes and candies. So maybe the idea of just a loan for good stewardship practice, we as Christians might ought to think about limiting ourselves in participating in some of those holidays, those ceremonies. And then what about viewpoint number 4? Just fundamentally, John kind of spoke about a little bit, research and get into a little bit of the history of just Google paganism and holidays. And you can chase almost any holiday that we celebrate. In fact, you can, days of the week, Thursday and the god of Thor. You can get into almost everything. I'm going to talk a little bit about even the idea of marriage, how much paganism has got into that kind of holiday. But if you look at Christmas, it was the idea of the beginning celebration of the return of the sun and the lengthening of the days that followed the solstice. These celebrations, began with things like decorating with holly, putting up Christmas trees, exchanging gifts, kissing under the mistletoe. They're all rooted in ancient fertility rituals. And I think most of us have some form of that in all our houses each year. They're all symbolic acts to celebrate fertility of the earth and the approach of the sowing season being completed. Ancient Rome celebrated the winter solstice with festivals. It was called Saturnalia. Again, what were they doing? It was featuring the Roman god of agriculture, Saturn, a season of equality where there would be a switch between the slaves and the masters, and they would reverse roles. There'd be public gambling. They would hang ornaments on trees. What were the ornaments? Celebrations to their gods, lowercase. You got the Norse people or the Nordic people. They would worship at this time the god Odin. And they celebrated, 12 days with bonfires and feasting and drinking. They would call this the Yule Day. They would also have a celebration for the Mother's Night. And then there would be the Yule tree that was decorated. The Greek origin, they would worship their god Dionysus, who they perceived the birthday was on December 25th. There would be filled with wild times, feasts, drunkenness, merrymaking for 12 days. Finland, into that culture, the goddess of belief was celebrated at this time. She rode a sleigh made of reindeer bones, pulled by a white reindeer. And then you get into kind of man's religion, this idea of man's evangelism. They decided to kind of, how do we evangelize and pull on all these pagan rituals during this time of year? Right? A little bit of the conversation of maybe we should celebrate it. It's all good that they're doing it. How do we marry all these things together? Well, we see that, John had spoken about that. Well, there was this great Saint Nicholas, right? The father of Christmas, the patron saint of children, who worked with children and prostitutes and the poor, and he gave out gifts to the children, and we'll kind of bring that into it. And then why don't we go ahead and symbolically celebrate this birth of Jesus Christ so we can bring in all these kind of pagan nations, right? Christmas, as we've known, has been canceled and reinstituted and canceled again with this idea of paganism and trying to avoid it. In fact, America here, it was removed in the Puritans, and then back in the 19th century, Americans again embraced it And in 1817 or 1870, it became a federal holiday. So this idea of paganism and Christianity and being a pure life is not new today. You know, it's been this idea of how do we evangelize all people? How do we adapt to the culture? I don't think we find that pattern. You can study the idea of Halloween, right? Where's that? That comes from the Celtic kind of pagan festivals. The summer's end, the beginning of the dark season, a time when spirits could move a little bit more easily. They could cross the realm from spiritual realm to physical. Places were set at tables. I mean, Jerry, can you imagine Brooke setting an extra 3 spots at the table during this time so that you might have spirits come and dine with you? The idea of, you know, bobbing for apples and roasting nuts on a fire. The idea of fortune telling through spirits. The Catholics attempted to spread the message this way with an All Hallows Eve, meaning an all holy day, celebrate with the holy saints. Martyrs and feasts for all saints. This was instituted by Pope Gregory III in the 8th century. And then even getting in, I talked a little bit about, you know, this idea of holidays and traditions and ceremonies. Think about a wedding, how much we have a tendency to think this is a relationship between man and God. And certainly it was, right? We see that great gift in Genesis chapter 2. But the idea of paganism has certainly kind of been in man's culture from the beginning of time. You know, we see in just Genesis chapter 6, right, that man had corrupted God so much that it needed to be purified. What? Within their ways and traditions. This wedding ceremony, you know, think about the veil that you put. Well, originally that idea was you would put the veil on to keep the spirits away, which could ruin your day. And then think about the flowers that we have in our weddings. Well, there was herbs and flowers and plants carried by the women. Why? So it would kind of warn off the spirits, the aroma of onions and herbs like that would kind of make them flee. Or what about your bridesmaids? It was first kind of through pagan worship with the idea of bringing escorts that would walk in front of the bride for what? To be dressed just like a bride. That they might be the ones sacrificed to the spirits, that they might come on top of them. And that the bride would be sacred and saved from these evil spirits. And then you even get into the wedding rings with the Greeks and the Egyptians and the idea of where that was and the vein of love connecting from this finger to the heart. You know, and you can go through multiple societies and cultures and look at that idea of how much paganism has affected holidays and ceremonies and some things that we've never thought about. That idea is just what we're talking about tonight. Because of these things of history, should we avoid them at all costs? Are we aware that some of these things might have different meanings than we understand? Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 4 tells us that you must not worship the Lord your God in the way that these pagans peoples worship their gods. You know, some of the conversations that we had earlier, it depends on what that purpose of that meat is. You know, we certainly understand if there's acknowledgement of that meat that was sacrificed to demons, well, we're not supposed to take it. But if there's no mention of it, it's okay. So, hey, come over to our house on Halloween and we're going to worship the demons. It's a little different in our response to it. And we certainly have that in our culture today, of those type of people celebrating Halloween that type of way. Jeremiah 10, verses 1 through 5. Don't take the godless nations as your model. Don't be impressed by their glamour or their glit. Their religion is nothing but smoke. An idol is nothing but a tree chopped down and shaped by a wooden axe. They trim it in tinsel and balls, use hammer and nails to keep it up. It's not a Christmas tree. Okay, this context is not a Christmas tree. But the idea of what are you worshiping? Why are you worshiping? How much has culture affected you? The culture in the land that you live. With what are we doing in our choices day by day? And what are you claiming it to be? Are you in the light? Are you the pattern that Christ had died for? Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 1 and following, God spoke to Moses. And again, you see multiple warnings from God to his people as they took over foreign lands and as they went into foreign lands. Do not follow the practices of this land. And verse 24, do not defile yourself by any of these practices The land itself and the people in it have become defiled. Why? Because they had separated themselves from the practices of God and implemented man's ways, man's celebrations, and man's types of holidays. So viewpoint 4, maybe we shouldn't practice any of these at all because they're all somewhat rooted in the idea of paganism. But the most important thing for our class today is to look at really the principles and how do we apply these for these holidays and the rituals and the things that surround us.
Now, it's going to be important that y'all think about, you're going to probably encounter people with all these different viewpoints. Now, I think what we've tried to present is the different varying viewpoints, and the reality is that our reaction is probably in the middle of several, if not all of these, in some way, the way they intermix, in the way that a Christian should really consider how they react or how they celebrate or what they do in the world that they found themselves in the culture around us. So what we try to do is find a couple of verses, some principles to kind of think about these, maybe to guide us as we think about it. So our first one we'll look at is 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We've got a few minutes here to go over these, hopefully. But 1 Corinthians chapter 10, really verses 14 through 30, but we're not going to read all those just because we don't have time to read all those. But look really down in verse 20 of chapter 10. Now, again, this is Paul again speaking to the Corinthians, and again, we're going to be talking about meat. All right, so again, you need to remember contextually what we're talking about is that, you know, there were certain meat that the Gentiles or those who did not know God would set apart and say, this is meat sacrificed to an idol. And so it was kind of like special meat to these people. In their mindset, it was holy meat to the Gentiles. You know, it was just special kind of meat. And so that's what we're kind of talking about compared to the Jews who looked at that meat and they're like, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. There ain't nothing special about this meat. It's just a slab of meat. So when you're thinking about the context of that, you'll see what he's talking about here and how those who were Christians were to keep in mind the culture that they had found themselves in. Does that make sense? Because Corinth was a mixture. When he wrote the book to the Corinthians, he had a mixture there of Jewish Christians as well as Gentile Christians there in Corinth. And so you'll see here the way he treats. Again, y'all, you can look at this whole chapter 10 and really kind of look at the idea of not becoming like Israel. And there's so many lessons from that. But look, verse 20. I say, those things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. That's going to be that meat. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord, that's the Lord's Supper, right? And the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Why? We are not stronger than he, are we? All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own good, but that good of his neighbor. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. But if one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience's sake. Now what is he saying there? What is Paul telling the Corinthians? If it's told to you that this is demon meat, this is meat sacrificed to idols, what should you do? You don't eat it. Why? Is it because the meat's bad? No. Is it because that by actually eating that meat that you're going to be worshiping demons? No. What are you going to do? What does that mean if you don't avoid eating that meat? If you were to eat it, what would that convey?
You condone that behavior.
You condone the behavior. You understand that in the scriptures? Again, go back and dissect that passage a little bit longer. But if you have knowledge and someone who's an unbeliever says, hey, this is meat sacrificed to idols or demons, and in this case it's sacrificed to idols, verse 20, it says, do not eat it for sake of the one who informed you. That pretty much means you are not doing it because your influence matters. So the point and principle from this biblical principle here is we should be careful that we never become joined with those who practice things that are contrary to God's word. We want to be a good influence on them, and the things that we do, the things that we're involved in matter. So if you're part of some Halloween festival where they say, hey, they're worshiping Satan, should you go to that festival? No, you shouldn't go. Even if you say, oh, I'm not worshiping Satan, I'm not going to be a part of that. I know what I'm thinking. I know what I believe. What Paul's saying is don't even go near it. Because by doing that, you're making sure and taking a stand. You're doing it for the sake of the uninformed one. the one who don't understand, who don't get it. And that's the same concept when it comes to holidays. That if you start espousing something that is not true, that is not right, it couples you with it. You condone it. And so I think that's one of the flags of caution to think about, is that if you're doing something that makes it appear that you condone something that is not true or not correct, then you might have a problem. Does that make sense? Second point. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Look at that one real quick. Just because, and then this is what I summarize here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, we don't have time to do all this, and read it all, unfortunately. But y'all look at this passage of Scripture here. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 13 tells us this: just because you eat meat sacrificed to idols does not make it a sin. The meat's not sinful. Again, we're talking about meat again. If we're involved in something, though, that causes another to stumble, then we start abusing our Christian liberty. And we got to be cautious and careful about those things. We do not want to sin against Christ or against God by being involved in those things which could hurt someone else. So again, you're looking out for others' sake, not necessarily your own sake. Does that make sense? When you're thinking about some of the things that you're involved in. That includes holidays. It includes bigger things too. Again, we're thinking much deeper here than just holiday celebration.
It also talks to your attitude, like I spoke about before. If you're the one that doesn't have a problem with something and it's God's indifference, then the attitude, you see the problem these people had in Corinth with this. It was an ongoing thing. He kept talking about it. But to me, the attitude is so important. The way we treat those that have a problem with that, we need to look out for whatever the thing we're talking about. We need to look out for others. And that's just the Christian attitude that we should have.
Everything.
Yeah.
And there are certainly, Jeremy brought this up, and our time's running out. We certainly have means and methods and commands for things that we are to celebrate. And we are set apart. And we do come together on every first day of the week to remember, to acknowledge, as we partake of the Lord's Supper, we proclaim it to the world. What? That we believe that Christ is God's only begotten Son, that He came, walked this earth, He died, He was buried, and rose again. It is not a one-day holiday or ceremony or event that part of the world tries to promote. The church is set apart, and sometimes through these holidays or seasons, it's easier to see the seed that Christ planted, His church, and its pattern. But those things that are not, you have the Romans application.
And it's good to be different, right? Because if someone comes to church with you around Christmas and there's no Christmas tree and there's no nativity scene, well, there's your opportunity. What makes us different? We're doing what the Bible says. And that's getting differenter and differenter, if you know what I mean.
Leave you with a couple things. As a father and as a parent, what I have probably learned more than anything is the idea of being as truthful and honest about what is true with your children. Your children will see through you. You may remember this, you're not as old as I am, but you kind of know what's going on around you sometimes, even as a kid, of, hey, what's fishy or what doesn't seem right or what's inconsistent. Did you ever look at your parents and say, that's not consistent, Mom and Dad? So, those kind of things. As a parent, what I would always say is what I have learned is try to make sure that what you teach your child is not something that's going to bring them down this road to error. And that's one thing that I've always been cautious with and careful with about like the Christmas and the Easter. I've been very honest with my children about why we don't celebrate it as some religious holiday and why we don't do it. And that's really because it's not true. Jesus was not born on Christmas. And so those kind of things are good to talk to your child about. That doesn't nullify, on the other side, allowing your children to be imaginative and be able to be children. We get into the whole thing, are you lying to your child about Santa Claus? That's one of the questions I think we've discussed before previously. And I think what I always come down to is I let my child be a child and be innocent. And then there's going to be a day whenever you have that frank conversation with them about what's right and what's ultimately the big thing, that that I'm Santa Claus. But, you're going to have that conversation one day. I know, surprise. There you go. of that. So I hope this has been instructive. If y'all have any more questions about that, please let us know. I think what a good takeaway from this is just because something may be rooted in old paganism doesn't mean necessarily it still means that today. But if there's ever a situation that makes it where it looks like it is, you should be careful and cautious about whatever you're involved in, I think, when it comes to holidays and the celebrations around it. Y'all have a great week. I think next week y'all, university, right? Combined next week? Oh, combined here with university here. So, okay.
Did you want to do homosexuality again?
I got a question.
All right, go
and
for
it's
it.
not necessarily a holiday, and that's why I did
Well, that's fine. Yeah,
last.
what's up?
But you had said, and this is kind of along